because really the overarching aim in this webinar is we're hoping to hear from you all about what we should do next. There is a task team with the Global Protection Cluster looking at anti-trafficking, and they are continuing to move forward. But I think there's a huge role for GBV specialists, and a lot of that will come out, I think, during Hannah Miller's presentation. But the question for us is, what more should we be doing? Is there something that we need? Do we need some tools? Do we need some specific guidance? Do we already know what to do? Should we be doing something different? This is hopefully an opportunity for us to begin to identify those things. And we have the advantage in the COP of continuing the conversation online through our messages. Next slide. So the aims of the webinar are, first, to talk about what works and what are the issues and problems related to trafficking in humanitarian emergencies. And then talk about next steps, roles, and actions that we as GBV actors should be taking. And it may be completely different regionally, but there may be some overarching, roles, responsibilities, something for the GBV professional. Okay, next slide. So as I said, our three speakers are Heather, Suzanne, and Hannah. Heather is with IOM, and Suzanne works for an NGO called La Strada International based in Europe. And Hannah Miller is with Justice and Care and has worked in human rights for many years. All three of these presenters are highly experienced and come with lots of experience and perspective and ideas. So we welcome questions and comments. Please use the chat. We allowed lots of time for discussion during this webinar. Next. Okay, so we will begin with Heather Comenda, who is with IOM. Take it away, Heather.
Great, just a quick sound check. I'm all good?
Yep.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for attending today. I'm really always very excited to get a chance to speak with people who are in the field where I was for 15 years, because when it comes to identification of trafficked persons, this is of course where the magic happens. I would like to start with a very brief definition of human trafficking. I'm sure most of you have received training on this, and we're happy to share literature on this, but I just want to focus really on a practitioner kind of common sense definition of trafficking. So first off, trafficking in persons is a process that occurs over time, and it has three components: an act, a means, and a purpose. The act can include recruitment, transportation, harboring, transfer, or receipt of a person using improper means such as coercion, deception, fraud, use of force, threats of force, abuse of power, corruption, etc., for the purposes of exploitation. Exploitation is a tricky concept because it doesn't have an international definition, but it typically includes or could include sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, forced labor, or some sort of extracting a benefit from an individual in an exploitative manner. Now, one thing that is important to highlight is that it's not necessary for all components or all elements of each component to be present in order to find trafficking in persons. Only one of each, one act, one means for the purposes of exploitation is the minimum threshold. Of course, we tend to typically see a process that does include things like recruitment, transfer of persons, etc., but it's not that all elements need to be present. And there is a very important exception there, which is in the case of children, where a means is not necessary. Simply an act for the purposes of exploitation is necessary. And this is because children cannot consent to their own exploitation. And also from a kind of common sense perspective, it is important to understand that trafficking does not happen by accident. And when we're in the field, we're going to be exposed to a lot of scenarios that look like, and I'm going to cover some of them, or resemble, or might be a component of trafficking. But it is important to remember that trafficking is done on purpose. Somebody is engaging in these acts and means for the purposes of exploitation. Identification of human trafficking is not always easy. It usually requires a degree of expertise to identify. This is a significant simplification, but there's typically two main pathways for identification. One is law enforcement, when police, border officials, other agents of the state engaged in law enforcement identify that a crime of trafficking has taken place. This is a particular input or pathway towards identification, and it is, of course, extremely valid and extremely necessary. It does tend to look a little bit different usually than the way protection actors, the way we go about it. It's kind of called the social pathway to identification, but really people engaged in protection are looking for the presence of a victim or survivor of trafficking. So this entails also different, for lack of a better term, investigation. So law enforcement would follow a law enforcement investigation, gathering evidence, interviewing victims and witnesses, doing surveillance, doing forensics, these sorts of things. And at the end of the day, seeing if a crime has taken place and who is the victim. Whereas protection actors tend to use a more social work approach, interviews, time spent with survivors of trafficking, and then they certify or identify that this person has a lived experience of trafficking. So for us, for frontline actors and for non-specialists, so non-counter-trafficking officers or protection actors without a deep experience in trafficking, I would say our main aims are to be familiar with the phenomenon, read a bit about trafficking, speak to anti-trafficking practitioners, but very importantly, and I'm going to return to this a few times, is understand local manifestations. Because trafficking is an issue that has been really sensationalized. There's a good degree of media coverage. Now it's pretty common in Law and Order Special Victims Unit has cases of trafficking in their episodes. And there's a lot of mythology around trafficking in persons. And it is a deeply, deeply contextualized phenomenon. It rises out of local social structures, local experiences, local dynamics, local relationships. So sometimes if we rely on what's coming out of the media or out of TV shows, it doesn't look like what's happening locally, and that can make us miss, actually, trafficking cases. It is very important to be prepared with the ability for emergency intervention. So this is something that I've experienced myself, being approached in the field with situations that require extraction, basically. And sometimes these situations can be quite tense, can be quite dangerous when somebody, for example, wants to leave their home immediately and you need to have transport and a place to take someone. It's critical to be prepared with appropriate referral information. Nobody expects frontline staff to be able to solve or to address everybody's needs immediately, but it is important to be able to refer people for the assistance they may require and to be prepared with emergency services. And sometimes this is just knowing yourself, a good focal point, having a basic understanding of which service providers can provide what service and when. And I think personally for frontline, it's really, really important to know relevant child protection actors because of the safeguards we have when working with children. And it is critically important to understand who is offering emergency shelter, because if we are faced with a situation that requires extraction, that's the first thing we have to worry about day one. Where is somebody going to sleep? Where are they going to be safe until we can get to grips with the situation? So what does it look like? So in the early stages, because it is important to be, it's truly critically important to be aware of trafficking in the early stages as a prevention measure, and also in conflict situations and humanitarian settings, there's significant concern that traffickers target these sorts of situations. So of course we want to stay on top of it and ideally stop it before it even starts. So what this can look like in the recruitment phase can be suspicious offers of employment. This is extremely common. Things that are too good to be true. No, you don't need any experience. We'll arrange everything. We've got your documents, etc. This, of course, is very, very appealing to people in difficult circumstances. And unfortunately, sometimes the appeal kind of overrides common sense. And it is important to be able to talk through and monitor these scenarios. So when I was working in a displacement context, this was quite a well-known phenomenon. Foreign recruiters were coming in and doing exactly this, offering jobs. One case of likely trafficking was interrupted because the recruiter gathered together a group of women and took them all for HIV screening, even though they were going to be working apparently in restaurants. So the concern was that they were being recruited into prostitution or sex work. So we want to pay attention to this. How this happens has evolved over time. Back when I was in the field, this was, the information boards in IDP camps. Sometimes posters were being put up there or in the local malls. Now there's a lot of WhatsApp, Facebook, chat apps, etc. Another process, this is a well-known and pretty well-established modality, not a great term, but lover boy trafficking, where somebody poses as a boyfriend or a romantic partner and starts a relationship. The person typically leaves with them. Again, it's important to note that transportation is one of the acts of trafficking, but it is not a requirement for trafficking to have taken place. But often there is a degree, not always, of separation of the target from their social network. This makes sense. If you want to exploit somebody, you remove them from the people that can help them. But there's also, in some areas, a brisk marriage market and early marriage issues that can become evident. We are seeing it truly is increasingly online trafficking. So there's been situations where children are targeted, offer tokens or something for video games that they're playing, and then the trafficker gets them to send revealing photos, and then it's a sex extortion case. And then they're forced through this sort of process of saying, I'll release these photos, I'll shame you if you don't send more and more graphic imagery. Then also sometimes we see, especially where we see large scale population movements, there's often potential traffickers or the recruiters hanging around hotspots like bus depots, transport hubs, when people are really on the move, but also at temporary settlements, outside accommodation or service centers. And the typical concern is in accommodation for children that and yet young people, that there's often lover boy types hanging out outside the institution to try to lure people away. So in the process of trafficking, this can be very, very difficult to identify trafficking, often because there's not cooperation often from the intended target of the traffickers, because they're still in the phase where they believe they're going for a job opportunity. They may have been told to hide from law enforcement, to not cooperate with protection actors, because the traffickers say, I'm taking you there regularly, or they don't approve, they want money. We have to hide what we're doing, but then you're going to get this great job and all's going to be well. So we may not have cooperation from the potential victims, but some things we can look at is if we see the same person or group of persons somehow involved with facilitating things for a series of people over time. So one example from my fieldwork experience is eventually border management services were able to identify a trafficking ring because they simply observed over time the same person was coming in every week, every couple of weeks, with 2 or 3 young women over and over and over. And so they noticed this going on as they were passing through border control. Also seeing individuals facilitating something. This is tricky because people have managers, and often managers facilitate jobs, contracts, etc. If you think about, somebody who has a crew of domestic workers, very often there's somebody managing. This is not necessarily always an indicator of trafficking. It's not always an indicator of trafficking, but it is still something in a displacement context we may want to pay, or an emergency context, we would probably want to pay attention to if this is not like a known company, if it's not known to be above board. And also, even though it sounds silly, known traffickers. When you're working in a location, especially if it's a bit smaller or say a particular camp, you start to know the people who belong and what they're doing. So when I was working once in quite a small context, I knew two traffickers by their faces and they knew me. One, I was always being called into immigration to do counseling for people who worked at his restaurant. And he was not particularly friendly, but we would walk in and out of the same doors and I knew who he was, he knew who I was. Once I was in a taxi and looked over and there was another trafficker who ran a brothel, and some of her victims had come to me for assistance, but she had seen me outside the police station, so she smiled and waved and off we went. So over time, your anti-trafficking experts will come to know who is actually actively engaged in trafficking in a community, unfortunately. Okay, at the exploitation phase, again, it depends. We typically, or we often will see some limitations in movement or in access. So another example, with this trafficker that I saw in the back of a taxi in her brothels, one of the means of control and exploitation is in order to leave the brothel, the women had to pay $20 an hour. So they rarely left. It wasn't that they were chained to walls, but there was methods for limiting their freedom of movement. And often it's difficult to access the location. So we can think about, say, a factory or a manufacturing place that is fenced with a guard out front, very common. We can think about bouncers or security. Another time there was a law enforcement action and law enforcement had bought the victims to me, and they said that their things were left at the brothel and they wanted to go and get them. So we got a police escort, 2 police, me, 3 trafficked persons, went to the location where the law enforcement action had just taken place. Law enforcement assured me it was empty. So we thought we would be able to go and get the belongings. But the second the police car stopped in front of the empty looking place, 20 men from all over the community all of a sudden showed up and lined up in front of the brothel. So there are very frequently ways of limiting access. Okay, so if we see somebody is always working, and it's just sometimes a comment like that, oh man, that kid is always working, that person is always working. When we're in the community and start to know the people we're working with, we can start to pick up on these things. Also potentially signs of maltreatment, malnutrition, injuries, untreated injuries, etc. Signs of psychological distress, being fearful, withdrawn, being hypervigilant, etc. And potentially members of a vulnerable group. So there is language about how anyone can be a victim of trafficking, and to some extent that is true. But typically it is more vulnerable members of society who are targeted by traffickers. And over time, it is important to become aware of the local modalities and what is happening locally. Because if somebody is targeting someone from a specific community, or specific communities are being targeted, this in and of itself becomes an indicator. It is important to not ascribe potential victimhood to anybody who belongs in a particular marginalized group simply due to membership of that group. But when we contextualize our information, we may identify trends over time. So what it looks like, problematic sectors, unfortunately, this is a long list, but these are known to be sectors that with the presence of trafficking. So domestic work, cleaners, house help, childcare minders, etc., gardeners, but also in hotels and restaurants, in bars and entertainment centers, for personal services, massage parlors, nail bars, etc., in agriculture, manufacturing, mining, fishing, and construction. So an important thing to do is actually think about what sectors are in your location, if there are any of these sectors, but also to talk to anti-trafficking experts in your area and find out if there's any known sectors that are more affected than others. Now, we often bump into related phenomenon. And it can be really, really tricky to tell the difference between trafficking in persons and some of these related phenomenon. Sometimes they're part and parcel of the trafficking crime. It is important to be able to tell the difference. So first, frauds and online scams. So we see there's very, very many examples of fraudulent activities. Fraud is everywhere. Fraud is all over the place online. It's in humanitarian settings. It's in non-humanitarian settings. If people can find a way to exploit people's desires, they will. So fraud and scamming, I think, is a potential indicator. And expert practitioners would, through interviewing, probably be able to figure out what is what. But it's also really important to understand also things like online scams can be actual trafficking. It might not be the person being scammed. So you have the scammy who is not being trafficked, they're being scammed. But there is a quite significant newer issue. It's got a long tail. It's been brewing for some time, but there are camps and settlements where people have been trafficked and they're forced to do online scams. They're forced to do love scams. There's some very interesting articles about this. So this is a concern. Labor exploitation, forced labor, and labor disputes. Obviously, labor exploitation is one of the purposes, one of the forms of exploitation in trafficking. Same with forced labor. There's also issues where it is not trafficking in persons, but there are genuine labor disputes. And this is relevant because it helps us determine what's the appropriate pathway. If it's labor exploitation, forced labor looks like trafficking, perhaps trafficking in persons or that protection pathway is most appropriate. If it's a labor dispute, potentially referral to a labor board is the appropriate pathway. Child labor, of course, trafficking, forced labor is one of the worst forms of child labor, child trafficking. And again, quite a lot of overlap, but it's important to understand child work, the local labor laws, and what actually constitutes exploitative or child labor. Now, prostitution or commercial sex work, in my field experiences, this is major, really kind of the hot issue where sometimes sex work is legal and is not deeply impacted by trafficking. Sometimes, regardless of legality, there is a lot of trafficking happening, but this can create quite a lot of confusion. And it's pretty sensitive because it can also create harassment of women at work. If people overascribe, again, victimhood to persons working in commercial sex. So it's something to be aware of. It's also very important to realize that a significant portion of trafficking in persons is for sex work. So we have to be aware that often intervention is required in order to help women exit this trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Okay, so migration, irregular migration, and or smuggling. So it is fairly well established that migrants, in particular irregular migrants, are more vulnerable to trafficking. But again, being a migrant is not in and of itself an indicator of trafficking. Again, if you have good local knowledge, you may, of course, start to understand that people from country A present in a particular workforce or particular industry in country B have a high risk of trafficking. Absolutely valid, but it does require understanding what's going on. But there are some correlations here. Illegal adoption and forced and early marriage are two hot topics that continue to be debated in the trafficking sector. So there are opinions that people can be trafficked for the purposes of illegal adoption or forced and early marriage. Some people are of the opinion that illegal adoption is off if it is not done for the purposes of exploitation. So if it's done by somebody who genuinely wants to adopt a child, they just do so illegally, that's not necessarily trafficking in persons because it's not considered, or it's not, so that they become domestic workers, it's they want to love and raise a child. Others see that this is inherently exploitative as it robs the child of their cultural heritage. So I don't have any solutions for you. I know there's different perspectives, but it is something to be aware of. And also there are some interrelations for people in vulnerable situations. These can unfortunately be maladaptive coping strategies. So selling children, thinking that it's in their best interest because the parents are no longer able to care for them. And we have seen in other humanitarian crises an increased practice of early marriage because families think that their daughters will be safer because they're unable to care for them. But this can slide into really horrific situations. Okay, so what is unique about how trafficking operates in crises, emergencies, and humanitarian settings? So first off, these sorts of situations create personal vulnerabilities. Displacement is associated with vulnerability to trafficking. Family separation is associated with vulnerability to trafficking. Harmful or maladaptive coping strategies, like I've just mentioned, child labor, for example, taking kids out of school or not having access to school because being in education is broadly protected, etc. Various things that families and individuals do to cope with the fact that they're in crises can increase their vulnerability. There's also social factors that increase vulnerability. So we have the social disruptions. People can't live their normal lives. So schools close, schools are damaged, their kids are taken out of school to work. Access to religious and cultural life is curtailed or interrupted. People aren't going to work, and there's just wide-scale social disruption. Often in these situations, we'll see intergroup tensions and conflict increase, which can be a driver for unsafe and irregular migration. It can create opportunities for traffickers to exploit vulnerabilities, etc. Disruptions of social spaces, which have negative impacts on social cohesion, and limited access to housing and basic and social services, which a lot of trafficking research shows is a really significant driver. When people don't have access to shelter and social services and health, they will move, and often that movement is unsafe or irregular. Now, how do we respond to this? So, well, actually, how it operates still in these situations. So we do very often, not always, very often see limitations in effective state response. So we see these 4 bullet points are a very simple abstraction of really the key pillars of an effective state response to trafficking in persons. And one is having an institutional setup for interagency coordination. So a proper response to trafficking does involve law enforcement. It does involve the justice sector. It does involve investigations and prosecutions. And I will talk on the next slide a little bit about some of the non-substitutable functions of law enforcement. But it also involves social protection actors, child protection actors, ministries of foreign affairs, if this is an international issue, ministries for the protection of women, labor, etc. So it's really quite critical to have actual formal setup to facilitate interagency coordination. Okay, law enforcement, yes. And typically we will see a national plan of action, which lays out the response, and also a national referral mechanism or local referral mechanism to connect survivors to the services they require. So we often see that this breaks down. So law enforcement isn't able to act, governments are stretched, people stop going to the referral meetings. Nobody's funding the national plan of action. Everybody's concerned with the crisis, and this just simply gets neglected. And in some situations, the state themselves becomes involved in trafficking in persons. So we can think about perhaps trafficking for the purposes of either directly participating in hostilities as an armed combatant or to serve local forces. For example, with porters, people carrying military supplies, and unfortunately, wives or people for sexual exploitation by soldiers. So then in such situations, we may or often do see the humanitarian system gear up to substitute, support, or do some of these functions. So for example, a protection working group facilitates coordination. Anti-trafficking task forces do the same, the GBV task forces, etc. All of these groups may do some of these functions, the coordination, the plan of action, the NRMs. You would not see those bodies engaged in law enforcement, but I have worked in situations where police were, let's say, nascent and unfull performed some of the law enforcement functions. We do often see local opportunism. And this is really important because local opportunism really reflects local situations. So I'll give an example. In one of the contexts I was in, an element of the conflict, it was intercommunal, was burning down houses and burning down local markets. So there was a child who was at the market with his family. Localized conflict broke out. They started burning the market. The kid was separated from his family, and a member of the local community snatched the kid and took him to his farm. And he was forced to work in agriculture and unfortunately subject to quite egregious abuses for a year. So it's not like that person, the trafficker, woke up that day, said, okay, well, I hope this happens. They just saw a situation and took advantage of it. But then it is also quite common for organized crime groups and trafficking networks to take advantage of the situation. So same context, at the beginning of the crisis, organized crime groups moved in, set up drinking houses and brothels, staffed them with lower level criminals, and trafficked people in to work into those situations. Valentina, oh, sorry. Yeah, I think, thank you. Okay. So what is our role as frontline non-trafficking experts? What do we do? And first off, it is observe. Be familiar to the extent possible with what trafficking is and what dynamics can exist, but just know your communities and talk about it with your trafficking colleagues so we can start to understand the situation of what's going on. If you have somebody, if there is somebody that you are concerned with and it is safe to do so, establish contact. This is a tricky one. Typically in my career, I was approached either by family members, by people that were concerned, or very commonly by community members. So kind of, in my experience, it's not the counter-trafficking people going out and making contact. That's kind of an investigative function. It's referrals to us, where then we try to establish contact. SMSs, having a little conversation in the community if it's safe. And if it's safe is a pretty loaded term. So I would say you want to have if possible, a brief conversation, say, this is who I am. If you need any help, let me know. Assess the situation with the affected person, if you can have a safe conversation, and with experts who are able to advise on local trends and realities. And law expertise can, of course, include law enforcement. Be prepared. Again, no one individual can meet everyone's needs or solve everything, but preparedness is really critically important here. If somebody makes a request for assistance and says, I need to get out and I need to get out now, and this has happened to me in the field many times, we need to know, how can we get out? If you need to get out of the IDP camp, literally, how are you going to get out? Are you walking out? Do you need an escort out? Where are you going? Are there any safeguard issues to take into account? Is this a child? Is this a person with children? Where are the dependents? If this person is removed, will this trigger actions for other people at harm, etc.? Preparedness is not easy. Facilitating exit or removal. So I have had situations where after assessment, it was pretty clear that the person could just get in my car and we could drive away and we could start the process. There have been times where I have had to call in a law enforcement action, which I do only with the explicit permission and request of the affected person. It can be a risky endeavor. I am very happy to report that my interactions with law enforcement have always been really professional and life-saving, but it is something that requires a local assessment of what the local realities are on the ground. Once somebody is out, look, you may have a relationship with them that the anti-trafficking community doesn't have. So it can be super important to support their recovery. Here, I think it's important to understand who is the case manager, who is responsible for what. But if you've been the one who's known the person, established contact, helped out, it's really important to, as appropriate, support them through this process. And of course, in your day-to-day work, advocate for the rights and well-being of trafficked persons and potentially trafficked persons. So some key concerns that I have definitely heard in the field is literally, I have heard protection working group members saying, we're not touching trafficking, it's just too dangerous. And I think this is a really unfortunate narrative. Addressing trafficking can be very dangerous. It can absolutely require the involvement of specialist police. But there have been findings that over time, trafficking has become less violent. That's a big thing to say, but it sort of makes sense because there are parts of the world, and this is again where local knowledge and contextualization becomes so important. There are parts of the world where, say, sexual torture is absolutely part of trafficking. But these sorts of acts are egregious and they mobilize populations against it. So that makes them a little bit high risk because unfortunately, trafficking, you can really fly under the radar a lot if you also avoid being so egregious and inflammatory in your abuses. So what we've tended to see is a bit of a shift more towards psychological coercion and control. It's more difficult to prove. It makes it harder for the trafficked person to understand that they really are in such a situation, because that's an element of the psychological control, convincing them that they're not or that they're to blame. So a risk assessment is necessary. I think I'm getting time. And this can involve cooperation with law enforcement. So it can be risky. Trafficked victims are sometimes trafficked by grandmothers, little old ladies. It can happen. And it's pretty low risk. I've worked cases where the traffickers were not physically present and it was basically zero risk. So I think it's important to not avoid it by saying it's too risky. Like I often say, you guys work in GBV. I mean, a highly motivated husband is a very scary thing also. So sometimes I don't think they're any scarier, less scary than traffickers. Okay, specialization of services. There is often sometimes also a narrative that trafficking is highly, highly specialized and only the most experts can ever touch it, whatever. Once somebody has exited a trafficking situation, their needs are very similar to other persons in vulnerable situations. Shelter, dignity, legal services. Sometimes in international trafficking, international return and reintegration becomes a bit more tricky. So there are some specialist services, but there's more similarities than I would say differences with other vulnerable populations. And some of the key limitations we face is translation services, if it is international trafficking, having safe spaces to work, to do interviews, etc., working with law enforcement when law enforcement is not reliable, and the fact that specific safeguards can, unfortunately, at times take up so much time that the time lag in itself creates protection risks. Okay, over from me and over to you, Suzanne.
All right, Heather, thank you. That was very, very thorough. And we did get some questions in the chat. But before we get to those, I want to go ahead and have Suzanne talk with us, and I will put her bio in the chat. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you also had to listen to all what you said already, and I will just add a few. I'm also conscious of the time, so I'm happy also to answer questions later. Maybe before I start, maybe very quickly a bit about La Strada International. So it's a European NGO platform. So we unite 33 NGOs in 24 European countries. We're only based in Europe, which wars and conflicts, severe conflicts are rare, but of course we have now Ukraine, but we're also part of a global network, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking. And maybe our members are providing direct assistance and support to victims. So they have shelters, legal support, psychologists, do prevention work, a lot of the work that Heather also mentioned to be needed. And they're all, as I said already, all NGOs and independently. But we are only based in Europe. So just to say that, but might anyone ever need a contact or need information from us? We are also happy to refer beyond Europe because we have quite a large network. Now, maybe to react to what Heather said, and I think she covered a lot, but I just to add a little bit to what she said. First of all, about the legal framework. Indeed, it's very important to know very well what is human trafficking and what is not. And I want to like to stress that while there is a uniform UN definition, which is actually also laid down in, for example, European instruments like the Council of Europe Convention and EU legislation, there are some differences sometimes at regional level. So you always have to note very well what is the existing legislation in the specific country you're based. For example, also the EU definition is recently revised and now also includes the exploitation of surrogacy, forced marriage, and illegal adoption. And that's not necessarily reflected in all the different legislations. However, if the three elements, as Heather explained, can be proven, you could prosecute a lot of forms under human trafficking. But again, you have to prove all the three elements. What is maybe also very important to note that even the definition, the uniform UN definition is the same. We see that definitions can differ in the legislation in different countries. We see that even in Europe, that it differs per country. And also, and that's maybe more important, we see that the application or the understanding of a definition or legislation is not always the same. Moreover, the application is not always the same. If you talk by law enforcement or an NGO or the labor inspectorate, or even among them, there might be differences in understanding. This is also why it's important to always speak and to continue to train people, also for us. But we still very often see that what is in one country regarded as human trafficking not necessarily always the same in another country. And there's also focuses, some countries focus still much more on own nationals and have little attention for migrants and refugees, while in other countries they're much more experienced with that. So that's also good to know. Also, maybe very important to know if we still talk about the legal definition, is that very often, while many countries in the world, nearly all, I would say, have a criminal article on human trafficking and have criminalized human trafficking, they very often have, and Heather said it already, not defined what is exploitation, and they also have no legal definition on what is exploitation, even though there are forms that they can look into. And also, they very often have not defined forced labor. So that means that if you have a case of forced labor, for example, you still have to prove human trafficking. And or if you see severe labor exploitation, you have to prove human trafficking. Otherwise, it's just a violation of the labor law. And then you see the biggest problem is then also that the victim of that exploitation has much less rights. And it is important to note that maybe you see something, see a case and you think this is trafficking, now everything will happen. But here I named already a few bottlenecks in practice, what you can come confronted with. Further, indeed, if I talk about referral support, trafficking is often a process. It also means that I, for example, or someone of you on the online, you are not necessarily ending up in a situation of trafficking from day one to day two. While everyone can end up in a situation, of course, we see some people being much more vulnerable than others. I said it already, migrants, refugees, undocumented people, people who work in irregular work, they have much more chances. But it could also happen to people who are legally there just because of a certain context, a certain situation that made them suddenly very vulnerable. For example, people lose their job, people lose family members, lose social structures, and then they might be somehow forced to maybe accept certain working conditions which they would not have accepted before. And then maybe over time, they become, the expectation becomes more severe. So it's not necessarily that people are trafficked on day one, but it can also take a period of several months or several years, even that people end up in a severe trafficking situation. And that makes it also very difficult to identify it. Even though it's very important to identify trafficking as soon as possible for everyone, also for the prosecution, this is therefore not always possible. And so there is a need to early identify it, but there's also a need for everyone who comes across to to stay calm, let's say, and to really see what can you do at this place. Also, as Hedda said, not necessarily everyone wants to be identified, or not necessarily everyone can leave the exploitative situation, because maybe they still are paid some money while trafficked, and they cannot leave, or they cannot leave a brothel, for example, even though they are forced to work in a brothel. There might be reasons why people, even themselves, think that at this moment they better stay in the exploitative situation. And that can be very confronting and very difficult, but it's unfortunately the case. Also important to know that people like us and you and other actors, we do not have the right to formally identify a person. What we can do is detect a person and see, we see indications of human trafficking, we see indications of exploitation, and then of course it's a whole process, and you need the right actors to formally identify. And how a person is identified as trafficked, that again differs per country. In the end, it's a formal person, or very often the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Justice, who identified who is trafficked or not. And very often, this is only the result of a successful prosecution taking place. As Hedda said, there could be a social path for someone to be recognized as violated in their human rights as a trafficking victim, but then still not having this possibility, if they don't want to work with the authorities or to file a complaint, to get the assistance and support they need. A few more things, I'm conscious of the time. The signs with Ukraine, for example, our members, and also in Ukraine, but also beyond, in Romania, in Poland, we received a lot of signs from volunteers, from humanitarian personnel who were placed in neighboring countries, that they saw things at the border, in shelter, at transport places. However, know that there was a lot of chaos at the beginning, so it was also very difficult for people to see who was in charge, who was not in charge. So I would also like to highlight here that it was we need to learn from earlier wars, and it was very, very important that people were vetted and that we know who was responsible at the border, who is responsible at the shelter, and that we can also avoid and prevent already exploitative practices. But also that, yeah, that you are known to everyone. Who are you, and what's your role? Also, important to know that even though we want to act, or law enforcement want to act, or other actors, not necessarily this is always possible, because we also need a certain kind of proof. And what we saw with Ukraine, that a lot of the indications we get, it was very difficult to further investigate them. People had very little information. Someone came with a car and someone stepped in the car. There was no number plate recorded. There was no name. There was nothing. There was no information to where the people were heading to. So if you have very little information, even if you call a specialist helpline or others, law enforcement, then there's little you can do. So we do always advise, also if someone comes to you and tells you about exploitative practices, to collect some evidence, to collect some proof, how many hours a person is working. Do persons have apps? Do persons have chat recording? That is all very important, unfortunately, later on, for proving that this is the trafficking cases. I also want to highlight that for traffickers, people, I notice on a daily level that people sometimes still have a wrong idea of who's a trafficker. Uh, and it's not necessarily an organized criminal group. A trafficker can be a parent, a friend, also legal companies, recruitment, employment agencies can be punished for trafficking. You become a trafficker when you committed the crime of human trafficking, and it doesn't necessarily always say something about the person, but it is someone who has pushed someone in a situation of exploitation, maybe for financial profit or for other reasons, and this person can be made responsible for human trafficking, and that can also be a big legal firm, for example. Heather mentioned some of the vulnerable sectors. Important, of course, to say that it can be both regulated again and non-regulated sectors. We do see in general that if people are legally working, they tend to be less vulnerable, also if they are legally allowed to work. And that's also why we were very happy that people displaced from Ukraine could legally work, because we think that this is one of the reasons why we saw less people from Ukraine trafficked so far. Of course, we don't have all the data, but what we see, it's still relatively low numbers of Ukrainians being trafficked. Lastly, if you come across a possible situation of human trafficking, I would really advise you to inform yourself to gain trust. Do not judge the situation too quickly. Do not act too fast. Do not necessarily come directly with a solution because there might not always be a solution, as we already highlighted. But think and inform yourself. Check with people, check with helplines, check with your colleagues what you can best do, and double check information, because we also see, especially among refugees and displaced people, there's also a lot of misinformation, information which is not correct. So it's always good to check the information. And lastly, indeed, Heather said it too, very, very important that you know the existing structures. Don't try to set up another NGO, another structure, another referral mechanism, too many emergency structures, because we see this also harms the existing structures. People start not to work with each other, but rather against each other, or people are no longer, the approach is no longer coordinated. So I would really advise use existing structures and really make use of what's already in place. I leave it here. And I'm happy to answer any possible questions later on.
So great. And we're getting great comments. I just want to say, I can see by the comments, there's one or two very specific, but people on this Zoom are already morphing their heads around, well, what does that mean exactly for our role? And I've seen a couple of questions that relate to our role. And I think that is part of the conversation going forward, because I also think different people on this call have different roles. You're not all GBV specialists necessarily. There is a specific question that I think it would be good to answer before we move on to Hannah, and that is, Richard just posted that. Where did it go? Somewhat specific, but do you think the combination of trafficking and smuggling in the EU facilitators package, yes, it's specific, is a good thing in theory, even if it's being weaponized by member states against migrants? Is that a quick answer question?
To who? To Heather or to me?
Either one of you.
So I think, Suzanne, are you able to answer it? Because I'm not familiar with the facilitators package, but I can talk about trafficking and smuggling a little bit.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, we in general, we understand why states want to address smuggling. And of course, it's important because what we also see that, we of course advocate for more open borders and much more legal opportunities. But we do understand why states want to address smuggling. It is closely related. However, it is a different thing, of course, as Heather also explained. With smuggling, it's a person pays someone to come from A to B, and it's more crime against the state. A person can become debt bonded in a smuggling situation or can become exploited, and also the smuggling can become trafficking. So it is closely related, but it's not necessarily. And what we also should not forget, and we work a lot with PICUM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, we see a lot of the actions and the measures taken against smugglers also indeed infringe of the rights of friends, families, because a lot of people are also helped by others. So the definition of a smuggler is it's different, and we are very much calling also to really use the UN definition, and at the AU level that differs a little bit. So you see that they have much broader approach. And also, we see that a lot of people are now criminalized, are actually migrant groups, family members, supporters, and that's quite, and also NGOs, and that's quite worrying tendency.
Okay, thank you. And thank you both, Heather and Suzanne. We will come back to you both, well, all three of you, after Hannah finishes for discussion. Hannah Miller.
Great, thank you. Heather, if you can just go back a couple of slides, that'd be great. So, so I work for Justice and Care. We are an international NGO that's focused on human trafficking and modern slavery. We work globally to join forces to end that. We work with about 150 organisations, I think, and we provide the whole variety of packages. Sorry, I should say we also operate in Bangladesh, Romania, across the UK, and then we have done in Thailand and India as well. And so we do the kind of host of packages really in terms of helping to rescue and support authorities and bringing survivors home safely, accessing and providing aftercare, and helping with prosecution of crimes. And then we work with the criminal justice system to help better detect and disrupt and prosecute traffickers. And we also do work around better prevention, and then we do research. And so for me, unlike Heather and I think Suzanne, I don't come with any field experience, but I come as a researcher. So so what we do as well is to look at systemic change as part of our research approach. So next slide, please. So what I'd love to share with you today, and it's great that Beth has been able to share it previously as well, is the research that we recently completed. And what we wanted to do was to do a global analysis of the gaps and the kind of priorities for looking for a more systematic approach to stopping trafficking or responding to trafficking in humanitarian settings. The research involved like desk-based research, but also we went out to all the different organisations that you can see on the screen. So these were the ones that we identified and who we got access to in terms of key actors in the humanitarian kind of conflict or crisis settings, and we did in-depth interviews to really find out from a practitioner perspective what the challenges were in the field and what that looked like in terms of trying to see systemic protection. And a part of the aim of the study really was to both be able to I guess get a better understanding of some of those earlier systemic problems, which what we know and what was confirmed is that trafficking or work on trafficking people has very much been siloed and has been fragmented at best, probably. So we wanted to see if that was still the case, to establish a current picture of vulnerability, which Heather and Suzanne have both spoken to, really, to see what progress has been made in the recent years and then to examine any promising practices. And we also did a case study on Ukraine. So what's clear, and I'm just going to pick out a few things because you all have access to the report anyway, but I think what was really clear is that there's been really great progress in terms of a significant growth of the awareness of risk to trafficking in humanitarian settings, and that the visibility of that being an issue has massively increased. And that's at a whole range of different levels, from the kind of policy, at the political level, at the local level, and in lots of different areas, as well as sometimes across media. And we saw that with the Ukraine case as well. And in some contexts more recently, particularly in Ukraine, what it's meant is that there has been, because of like an extraordinary level of attention, there has been a readiness to respond from the outset, and a mobilisation across civil society as well as part of that broader protection response. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do just to pull out some key aspects that hopefully will be of use to those of you on the call, but also it kind of speaks to lots of stuff that Heather and Suzanne have pointed to. So I will go through quite quickly. Hopefully it kind of complements but frames it in a slightly different way to what we've heard. So in terms of thinking about systemic protection, that was our focus, and what we wanted to do is to look at where the systemic situation is in terms of specialist anti-trafficking capacity, and obviously that's needed for a whole host of different things that Heather's very eloquently kind of spoken through, but you know, includes things like being able to have these rapid risk assessments, have specialist protection infrastructure, and be able to do a whole range of different key things that is needed in the field in that space in that time. And what was being very clear from our data is that there remains quite a sizable gap in longer term investment in specialist protection. And this we can see, and our participants spoke about, across funding environments and donors and UN agencies, but also large international NGOs who hadn't, or for various reasons, were unable to prioritise having specialist anti-trafficking capacity. And so what it has meant is that there continues to be a more reduced available workforce, and also specialist staff end up being deployed from different settings, even though they might not be familiar with the local context or the broader dynamics of that. And as Heather has explained very clearly, you know, the context of trafficking is deeply contextualized phenomenon, and so being able to know that context is so critical. And so when that lack of available workforce is present, it becomes a huge kind of issue in terms of being able to have some systemic response to the context and the phenomena. And sorry, just to go back, Heather, if we just go back one, please. And we found that so not only has there been issues with the specialist capacity, but also gaps in the frontline capacity as well. So and I guess it very much kind of speaks to some of the things that we're looking at today in terms of frontline workers being able to know what trafficking would look like or might look like in that context, and how to respond to that, and what the process should be. I won't kind of go over it much at all. You know, Heather's talked about the issue of being, you know, familiar with the local manifestations and what emergency intervention should look like, and what those appropriate referral information and those services should be. And then also it was quite clear that at times there are real challenges with having a kind of back end or a multi-sectorial response, and having it as a coordinated thing in place continues to be an issue. And I think as part of that kind of broader picture, what we found as well, which again can be for the frontline organisations, is where there are strong safeguarding mechanisms in place, or strong training or capacity building, then there were greater opportunities for a more systemic approach in those contexts. But where organisations were unable to have that level of understanding, then that provision it has been kind of reduced quite significantly. The next slide, please. It was very clear that there were real barriers, or there continue to be real barriers, to understanding the full dynamics of trafficking, and both Heather and Suzanne have spoken to this. So we see this at those different phases that Heather kind of spoke through, but also, as Suzanne just kind of pointed out, that classic organised criminal group lens just does not fit neatly in these contexts. Also, our participants spoke very much about the challenges with identification, and what some of the problems are with that formal process. And of course, this is needed in order for different people to be able to access the assistance that they very much need at that point. And that can go from anything from fear and distrust of authorities or law enforcement agencies not having the capacity or the training to know how to sufficiently identify victimhood, or knowing how to do trauma-informed or gender-sensitive approaches, as well as things like absences of safe locations, or not having local mediators who can help with that process. Next slide, please. And then we looked at a Ukraine case, or we developed a Ukraine case study, and we wanted to look at the risk to trafficking in there, and also the progress and challenges that are made, that we can see from that case. I think I won't really go into much detail because I'm aware of time, but the detail is in the report that we wrote, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to kind of speak to those. And I know that Heather and Suzanne also come with a great understanding of that context as well. I mean, I guess one of the points maybe just to pick up on there is the European Temporary Protection Directive has been a real place where resilience has been more possible because of their access to work and different protections that people who have moved across and out of Ukraine have been able to access, although it's problematic in lots of kind of different realms, but we probably don't have time for that. So next slide, please. Funding continues to be a very big challenge in this area because of the limited and inflexible funding that typically is present. And I'm sure as GBV, especially as you're all very aware of that in your own context, but it definitely is the case in the trafficking sector as well, where that continues to be an issue. And it our participants spoke a lot about the fact that meant that it could be quite complicated to try and work with different partners because of different funding technicalities. Okay, and then next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is just to point out 4 things that we would identify to be some of the key priorities in terms of building that capacity. So the first one is to have greater investment in terms of having longer term investment. And so to be able to do that would enable greater systemic responses. And then secondly, to have an enhanced systemic protection. And I apologise, what I haven't said actually is what our research participants spoke about as well is that what they found was that at times where there's not systemic protection in place, then different AOR practitioners, so GBV or child protection, would pick up people who were likely to have been in context of trafficking, even though that might not be directly the provision that was in place. And their concern that was mentioned quite a few times was that is potentially okay if they are in a context where the phenomenon kind of carries over with what you would find as a GBV practitioner, but where they may be like male, adult, people who are in a position of labour exploitation, and they would kind of fall through that net. So that was often something that our participants spoke about quite a bit, where there was lack of systemic protection. What would you do if the existing AOR provision didn't sufficiently cover that? And the next point, please. It was very clear from our research that preparedness is absolutely needed. Heather and Suzanne both spoken to this, but so this, very much involves knowing what should be in place and what already exists and being able to use that sufficiently, and to not set up other emergency structures that then become quite problematic. So again, our participants are very clear on the fact that sometimes parallel systems get put in place and it becomes very problematic in terms of being able to effectively use those things without being in contradiction. And then the final point, please. Oh, sorry, these two come together. So, utilising existing structures and actors is key. And I guess it's probably really worth highlighting. There have been other things that Heather and Suzanne have spoken to, but I think in terms of the use and availability of local actors was very much highlighted across many of the interviews that we had. The value of a local actor who understands where the child protection and social services and all those different agencies and opportunities is incredibly valuable. Now, it's very complicated because often those local actors are at risk themselves and are significantly overworked and overstretched, and often might find it challenging to get to the table of those decision making kind of places where decision is being made for protection. So the value of the local contribution was a significant point. Okay, so I've kind of rushed you through, but I think I will stop there. Thank you.
I do want to add just one thing, that Hannah shared the report with us in the community of practice early in the year. And one of the things that jumped out at me was that without it ever being said clearly, there is a lot of expectation in the humanitarian community in many settings that the GBV actors will take care of trafficking if we find it. And then the GBV actors, correct me if I'm wrong, Hannah, but they were kind of like, oh, what? Hello? Okay. Sure. We do house painting. We do airdrops. We do GBV. We do sexual exploitation. We do trafficking. We can figure it out. And this, I think, is a very important finding because it relates actually to many of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat, which is, what is our role? Our role, if I am a GBV specialist, setting up prevention and response to GBV in my setting, whatever GBV looks like in my setting. And my work is kind of facilitating that and setting up these coordination mechanisms, making sure there's trained people who know what they're doing. What is our role in that? And each organization defines it differently, but we as a specialty, I guess, within the humanitarian community have also not really had this conversation. So I'm seeing some comments like, well, what do we do about witness protection? Well, what do we do about protecting the families back home if they're being threatened? I mean, I'm seeing specific questions, but I'm also seeing, some real things of like, well, we shouldn't be going to law enforcement. Is that our role? Is that doing harm? And again, it's very similar to the conversations we often have around sexual exploitation and abuse. Is it our job to go and report? Is it the GBV program's job to go and report? We just don't know these things. So we've got really like about 10 minutes. A few people have dropped off, but not that many. Obviously, there's real interest. So I just want to open it up if people would like to raise hands and ask questions. Maybe either Suzanne or Heather, I don't know which of you would like to answer the question about what do you do if their families back home are being threatened?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to stop my sharing also so that good. Okay. So somebody else also asked a question about training materials and the intersect between GBV and trafficking. And I'm just going to share where we're at organizationally. It's a bit dull, but we've changed our organizational division so that our GBV sits alongside our counter-trafficking experts or programming. And one thing I have noticed is specifically this orientation towards case management, exit, and reporting. And I looked into this specifically because there is, in my experience, a slightly different ethos underpinning this, and I really had to reflect on it. So I am not an expert on GBV, and I have not worked on GBV specifically in the field, but I get the sense that the idea is because very often GBV survivors are cohabitating, married to, dependent upon their abusers. It is quite a different situation than trafficking in persons in this regard, because trafficking and victims of trafficking are more or less living in slavery, although these terms are very loaded. And in my experience, they want to get out, and they want to get out now. The second, often, not always, but by the time they're making a complaint, they've reflected on their situation and they want to leave. Suzanne has said often we can't move too quick. This is also true. Sometimes people need to think it over. But the contexts are different. And this is why I specifically focused a bit on preparedness for exit, because it is a very dangerous time for trafficked persons, the same way we know very well it's the most dangerous time for GBV survivors when they aim to make a move to leave. So I think calling in law enforcement and reporting are two very different things. For me, I basically never reported to police. We would do what, for lack of a better term, we call supported reporting, because I absolutely have had clients who tell me they want to share their experience, they want to help others, they want to take action against their traffickers, they want to report to police. My job was to counsel them, tell them what I knew, talk through different scenarios and what I thought might happen, what, based on my knowledge and experience, police could and couldn't offer them, and then absolutely go with them if that's what they've wanted to do. It is more frequent, in my experience, that they do not want to report to police. And then we didn't report to police. Now, as there is a bit of a discussion in the chat, I am seeing more and more requirements for reporting. These are usually binding on local NGOs. So it is absolutely critical to know what the requirements are and to think through what that means for your organization. As an international organization with some privileges and immunities, we're able to be guided by what the client, what the affected person wants. So it is really case by case, but there's some broader things to think through. Is immediate exit the aim? Is this the only chance this person has to escape a life of slavery? And are we prepared to act on it if necessary? They're big questions. I'm not sure I fully answered it, but that's my reflections.
Yes, and maybe I quickly add, now I do understand some people want to exit the situation immediately, others not. What we see in particular also with with sex work, but also with forced criminality, it's very difficult, not if people want to testify, but of course they're known already in the field, so it's very difficult and also very dangerous. What we see in a lot of countries now is that people try to get out of the field and maybe decide not to report. The problem is only that if people not report, and that's unfortunately in many countries, also beyond Europe, then they have much less chance to get adequate assistance and support. And I would like to stress, we always do that, that every actor has its own responsibility. So definitely, no, I don't think that you or me should take up the role of the law enforcement. Also, it can do harm. We see also a lot of NGOs doing financial investigations. Certain information can definitely help the police. We also know that the police actually wants more information from the NGO, but it's also difficult because at the same time you have the level of trust. And as Heather also said earlier, you always need the consent of a person. Luckily, we're not forced to report a person. So it's always difficult, but I would say everyone should keep his own role and see what you can do, and at least already informing, talking about seeing vulnerabilities, highlighting indicators. I don't think that anyone of should. I mean, I worked 21 years in the field. I've seen many cases of human trafficking, but I've never personally identified a case. I mean, unless a case came to me. And I think most of the actors in this field have not done it. It's quite rare. Of course, some people can do that more often. People working at the borders see more signs than others, but it's not necessarily likely that you will automatically be able to identify a person, but you might identify a vulnerable person or vulnerabilities. And if that later becomes trafficking or not, that's probably a longer phase. And as Heather also earlier said, the most important is that to know whether this person needs information or support, than to say immediately this is a trafficking case. Because we should not be too quick. At the same time, I do also agree we need to get the person out of an exploitative situation as soon as possible, when possible. There was another question, but I forgot what the question was. But there was another question. But otherwise, I'll leave it for other people to raise questions.
I thought you got them. I think you got them.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing we just have like about 5 minutes left, and I don't see other questions. Additional questions that are different. Sorry.
There is one long from Kirsten. Kirsten, I started to type, but you've asked a set of really good questions. I can talk for 1 minute maximum. Guidance, basically there's a set of questions about what to do when there's inadequate services and inadequate expertise. And this is a massive, massive issue. I used to work in the Horn of Africa, and the Djibouti route you'd go hundreds of miles before seeing another person. So what I was trying to type up is here, this speaks again to preparedness and services mapping. I know you guys do this, so absolutely do a service mapping. Find really any expertise you can find, see what can be repurposed. And very often in the field, The trafficking experts will look to the GBV, and the GBV will look to the trafficking, because we're all doing social work and social protection. And with some cross-fertilization, I am aware that there's specializations, but with some support for each other, we can, I think, help each other out with some of our populations, because there are some overlaps in our services. So very frequently when we're starting up new anti-trafficking programs, we talk to the GBV, DV people to understand what's going on. Also, in this day and age, some remote support. Like, remote support does not answer or fix this problem, but I often do coaching for case managers who, you know, have a social work background. They're just not sure what to do with trafficking cases, so they talk to me. I don't talk to the clients directly, but I guide them through this process. And I would say, you know, for the organizations on this call, know which organizations have resource persons, even in the region, who would be willing to do that, to support you through it. This do no harm issue, it comes up a lot with police, but I think we've addressed it. And there's been a couple questions on guidelines for frontline grassroots actors. We will share through the facilitator. All of us have too much information about this, but we'll give you the best.
I want to remind everybody that we will collect all of this, and these are including how to answer some of the questions that are in the chat that we were not able to discuss. Another thing is that I think I posted the web link for the Global Protection Cluster. So you know that gender-based violence and child protection fall under the umbrella of the Global Protection Cluster in humanitarian settings that are for IDPs, internally displaced, UNHCR, when they're refugees. So there is a task team that has been alive under the Global Protection Cluster for, actually, I hate to say, it's like 8 years or something that task team was formed, without necessarily a whole lot of concrete answers. But many of the questions that are starting to come up right now at the end of this conversation fall under the roles and responsibilities of the protection cluster in humanitarian settings, and their link with local law enforcement, local government, all of those things. And the GBV area of responsibility also has some specific roles under that. It's muddy where trafficking is concerned. It's more clear, at least the limitations are more clear, when we're talking about sexual assault or intimate partner violence or child sexual abuse. But when we morph into trafficking, I think a lot of us just still have a lot of questions. So I really urge you to participate in the conversation on the COP chat after this webinar. We need a little bit of time to get the recording together and collect all the materials. And I want to just say a huge thank you to our 3 presenters today, Hannah, Heather, and Suzanne. Each of you bring a really rich set of experiences to this conversation. And I feel like we've hit the tip of the iceberg only of what all you could be sharing with us. So we really appreciate your time. And for those of you members who joined this webinar, thank you for joining. And please fill out that poll before you leave. So we'll close now, and thank you very much, everybody.